This is our second week on Sartre. Last time, we looked at Sartre's distinction between transcendence and facticity. Remember, facticity refers to all the facts about my body or my past, the sorts of facts that there are about all objects. Facts like, what color is it? What shape is it? Where is it? Where did it come from? These are facts over which we have no control. And in this way, facticity stands in opposition to transcendence. Transcendence refers to my complete freedom to choose who to be in the present and what to do in the future. According to Sartre, this freedom is wholly unconstrained by my facticity. We saw last time that anguish is the experience of our own freedom. This time, Sartre introduces shame as the experience of our facticity. Sartre explains on page 302 that I feel shame when I become aware of some other. And more specifically, on page 345, he explains that I feel shame when I become aware of being looked at by the other. When I become aware of another person looking at me, I experience myself as an object, on a par with all of the other various objects that other person could look at. But Sartre goes on to explain, on 358, that shame is not just experiencing myself as an object, but experiencing myself as an object in the world of another person's freedom. So the thought here is that if I'm in the middle of doing something, and another person looks at me doing it, that other person is free to assign a meaning and a value to what I'm doing that could be divergent or wholly at odds from the meaning and the value that I assign to what I'm doing. So for example, if I've undertaken to build a wooden sculpture in my front yard to beautify the neighborhood, a passerby might see what I'm doing and think that I'm leaving a pile of scrap wood in my yard and making the neighborhood look trashy. So Sartre's thought is that when the other looks at my projects, I come to see my projects from the point of view of the other, which is outside of my control. And in this way, I come to lose my control over the meaning, significance, and value of my own projects. So I come to lose the standpoint of freedom over my own free actions. Now Sartre explains on 369 and 70 that the problem arises not just when other people actually look at what I'm doing, but more so when there's the mere possibility of others looking at what I'm doing. So the thought is, whenever I'm in the middle of an undertaking, I'm haunted by the thought of what others would think. So I'm continually losing control and freedom over the meaning and the value of my projects. Now Sartre thinks there are four basic kinds of human relationships, all of which arise out of our attempts to overcome shame. These four basic kinds of relationships are love, masochism, sadism, and hate. So through all these relationships, I'm seeking to no longer see myself as an object in the world of another's freedom. Now Sartre thinks that all four of these basic relationships fail. They're all attempts to overcome shame, but none succeeds in overcoming shame. The first sort of relationship that Sartre discusses is love. Sartre thinks that when we enter a loving relationship, we're trying to take control over another's freedom. The way Sartre puts this on 479 is that when we enter a loving relationship, what we're seeking to do is to become the whole world for another. So the thought here is that while we are still in the world of another, we don't feel shame because the other values what we do, no matter what we do. Okay, so the thought here is that if I enjoy listening to a particular musical group, while I'm enjoying listening to it, I'm haunted by the thought of what others would think of my listening to this group. And when I apprehend what I'm doing from the perspective of the other, it becomes outside of my control, whether listening to this musical group is cool or not. And so I feel shame when I consider the possible disparity between my own appraisal of what I'm doing and a possible other's appraisal of it. Now, a loving relationship helps me avoid this shame because when another person loves me, I know in advance that they'll positively value whatever it is that I do. Right, so the thought here is that the person who loves me thinks the music I'm listening to is cool, no matter what that music is. Now, Sartre identifies three problems with love, three reasons why love inevitably fails as an attempt to avoid shame. The first is that there's always a possibility that the person who loves me will stop loving me. One day, my taste in music might get so bad that the person who loves me just can't go on thinking this is cool. The second problem is that there's always a third or a fourth or a possible fifth person who can look at me and the person who loves me. The third person says, you think that music's cool, and the person who loves you thinks that music is cool, but it sucks. And so even if I see myself in the person who loves me's eyes, there's always the possibility of seeing myself in another's eyes. The third problem with love is more of a conceptual problem. Sartre thinks there's an infinite regress in a loving relationship. So the thought here is that each person in a loving relationship seeks to be the whole world for the other. So the person who loves me thinks that whatever music I think is cool. And I think that the cool music is whatever music the person I love thinks is cool. So we can imagine two people in love trying to decide what to listen to. The first person says, well, I'd like to listen to whatever you like to listen to. And the second person says, well, sure, I like to listen to whatever you like to listen to. And the problem is that they never end up listening to anything. So in this way, Sartre thinks love is totally empty. Now, if love is an attempt to get control over the other's freedom so as not to be one object among others in the world of their freedom, masochism, the second basic form of human relationship, according to Sartre, is the opposite of love. Masochism is an attempt to become nothing but an object in the other's world. It's an attempt to wholly get rid of one's own transcendence. So the thought here is that I can avoid shame if I get rid of my own transcendence, because the other can no longer judge my transcendence in a way that diverges from my own judgment. So the way masochism attempts to rid oneself of transcendence is by becoming the most desired object, or the most useful object, in another's world. Now, I think it's important to note for Sartre that masochism is meant to be the name of a very generic sort of relationship. In this way, it's different from the common way we use the term masochism. So masochism is meant to refer to any sort of relationship in which I attempt to become someone else's friend by becoming useful to that other person, indispensably useful. So the thought here is that if I'm the only person who has a car in my group of friends, then my friends won't negatively judge what sort of music I play in the car because they so desperately need a ride. Now, Sartre thinks masochism is doomed to failure because it's impossible for me to escape my own subjectivity. The idea here is that masochism itself is a project of mine. In order to be the most useful object in another person's world, I have to undertake the project of becoming the most useful object in another person's world. And in undertaking any project, I feel anguish in the experience of my own freedom. So while masochism is an attempt to wholly rid myself of my awareness of my own freedom, in every instant of undertaking to be a masochist, I become aware of that freedom. Now, while masochism is an attempt to rid myself of transcendence, sadism is an attempt to rid the other of transcendence. In fact, Sartre thinks that there's a continuum of indifference, desire, and sadism. In each of these attitudes towards the other, we're attempting to take away the other's transcendence. Indifference is the most passive, while sadism is the most active and violent. Sartre explains that indifference is either ignoring other people altogether or treating other people merely as useful objects with respect to my projects. So for example, if I'm reading a book in a cafe and I become worried about the opinion that the waiter might form of my choice of book, I can avoid the shame of taking on the waiter's perspective on my reading choice by negating the waiter's perspective. And I can do this by reducing the waiter to a mere waiter. It's as if I say to the waiter, your opinion doesn't count because you're just a waiter. Desire is a slightly more aggressive attempt to rob someone of their transcendence, while indifference reduces people to their functions with respect to my projects. Desire reduces people to objects of my value judgments. Desire is just looking back at someone's look. So here, I might say to someone, your opinion of me doesn't count because you're just a pretty face. Now, a problem with both indifference and desire is that while I might try to discount your opinion, you still hold your opinion. And so you still represent an independent perspective on me as an object. This is why Sartre thinks we resort to sadism as a more extreme form of desire. While in desire, I treat people as objects of my value judgments. In sadism, I treat people as my own puppets. I attempt to control others' actions in the way that I might control a useful tool. The way sadism can be used to avoid shame is by controlling the opinions of others. The worry that gives rise to shame is that your interpretation of what I'm doing, or your value judgment about what I'm doing, might diverge from my own. Now, I might try to remove the possibility of this divergence by forcing you to interpret what I'm doing and value what I'm doing in precisely the way that I interpret it and value it. So if the sadist is reading a book in a coffee shop, they'll attempt to get the other to say, that looks like such an interesting book. You must be quite intelligent. The problem with sadism is that even if you can force someone else to say this, you can't force them to mean it. And here, we can see the problem with indifference, desire, and sadism. The transcendence of the other is simply out of reach. Even if for a moment I can treat another person as a useful object, or as an object of my value judgments, or as a puppet in my world, there always remains the possibility of the other person looking at me. And it's this possibility that brings on shame. Now, hate is the fourth and the last sort of basic interpersonal relationship that Sartre identifies. While in sadism, I try to turn the other's transcendence into mere facticity. In hate, I allow the other their transcendence, but oppose it in every instant. So in the case of hate, I say to someone, I know you'll form opinions about me and what I'm doing, but because I hate you, I know that all of your opinions will be wrong. The problem that Sartre identifies for hate is that even if we could succeed in hating every actual person in the world, we couldn't hate every possible person. And it's the mere possibility of others that makes us feel shame. Shame arises from the very possibility of there being an independent perspective on who I am and what I'm doing, a perspective that I can adopt on myself, but a perspective over which I have no control. That's what makes me into an object in the world of others. And the thought is, no matter what I do to the actual others that I live with, even if I hate them all, nothing that I do can take away the possibility of that independent perspective on me. Now, Sartre claims that these 4 types of relationship, love, masochism, sadism, and hate, are the 4 basic sorts of relationships among humans. One thing you might do in your paper is evaluate this claim, but I'd like you to go further than this and think about the implications for authenticity and bad faith. When Sartre introduces the terms transcendence and facticity, he says that there should be a way to coordinate these 2 aspects of ourselves into an authentic life. What would an authentic life look like in the context of others? In thinking about this, I'd also like you to consider the characters in No Exit. To what extent do they exhibit the 4 basic patterns of relationship? To what extent are these 4 patterns inevitable? And to what extent is authenticity still possible, if at all?